haunts me to think that there are people out there that could just throw somebody away like that.
A brutal killing.
Her body was in a state of decomposition. She had gone through cycles of freezing and then thawing. It was either she stayed or she wasn't going at all.
A dark mystery with more questions than answers.
She was screaming and crying. She was telling us that it wasn't true, that we were lying.
She said, if I ever find out you're messing around with my husband, I'll kill you.
There's no question of the husband is going to be someone that's going to be looked at. There's only one person that had the opportunity to commit this murder.
The truth will be revealed.
When people are competing for love, we're prepared to act like animals.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. On the coast of northern New England lies the picturesque city of Portland, Maine.
Portland's a small city. I mean, it's only about 70,000 people. It's a very quaint place to be. It's extremely nice.
Murder is very uncommon in Portland. Violent crime is very low.
Where you have a large metropolitan area having hundreds of murders per year, Portland, you might go 3 or 4.
But on a gray and chilly January afternoon, factory worker Kerry Scott receives a phone call about his missing SUV.
Kerry Scott had attempted months prior to report his car had been stolen. He was told at the time that it was joint property because he was married. So no actual official stolen report was put out. Fast forward 2 months, and Kerry's friend happened to be walking through the motel parking lot, and he saw the red SUV.
He looked, he said, boy, that looks like Kerry's vehicle. And so he called Kerry and said, hey, it's your plate number, and gave the plate number.
Kerry said, that's my truck. I'm going to come out and get it.
2 months earlier, Kerry's SUV had disappeared after being borrowed by his estranged wife, Margarita Scott.
So Kerry gets to the motel and went around to the driver's side. Then he decided he opened up the back door. And when he looked in, he saw it was, in fact, his wife, Margarita.
He immediately backed away from the vehicle. He didn't try to pull her out of the vehicle to see if she was okay or anything like that. It was clear that Margarita had been there for some time.
I can only imagine how terrifying that was for him to see after all that time.
To discard somebody in the way Rita was found, I mean, she was, shoved behind the seat of a vehicle and then left. I can't think of anything more degrading than that. It haunts me to think that there are people out there that have the ability to not only commit the crime, but then to just throw somebody away like that.
The way Margarita Scott's body is found provides few answers about what actually happened to her, and raises more questions about who she was and what her life was like.
Margarita Scott, she was a really sympathetic figure. She was an immigrant to the country, but she graduated from the local high school. She was working hard to make a life for herself in America. The people who loved her cared very deeply for her.
Tasked with investigating Margarita Scott's murder are veteran homicide detectives Rich Vogel, Carl Ryback, and Scott Pelletier.
When we arrived, there was snow on the ground. It was cold. I noticed already that there were not a lot of people around, which for me is a good thing. I'm always thinking about, okay, scene preservation.
And so we went up, opened the doors, and looked at what we had. Me, personally, I thought it was a sex crime had taken place. It just looked like something gone really bad. And then the whole story started developing.
Margarita's body was in a state of decomposition. She had gone through cycles of freezing and then thawing just due to the fluctuation in the temperatures and being in the back of the car. She had sustained a gunshot wound to her neck. The gun probably was a .40 caliber high point. There was no signs within the vehicle that there was any type of struggle. There was no ballistics. We didn't find any gunpowder residue. We did not find any bullet holes. Minimal blood.
We know there was a gun fired and a bullet not in the body, so the bullet's got to be somewhere. We're now looking for a crime scene.
When you see a drive and dump, or you see a victim in the woods, or you see, like in this case, a victim concealed in a car, the question is, where did this murder happen? Because that's where most of your evidence will be left behind. And until you find that, you're sort of behind the eight ball.
Detectives begin their investigation into Margarita Scott's murder by focusing on the last 24 hours of her life, starting with her husband, Carrie.
The person that knows Margarita the best, obviously, would be her husband. So we were very interested in speaking with him right off the bat to get the initial story behind what would have led Margarita to end up in the backseat of the car found in a motel parking lot.
When brought in for questioning, Carrie Scott tells detectives that he last saw his estranged wife 2 months earlier, on November 10th, 2012.
Carrie and Margarita had been together for at least 8 years. They met in Florida and eventually moved back to Maine so Margarita could be closer to her family.
The marriage between Margarita Scott and Carrie Scott was, I think it's safe to say, a unique one. They had both come from Kazakhstan. At the time that she had gone missing, they were split up. They had sort of gone their separate ways.
She wanted to be out of the house doing things more fun. Carrie was a workaholic. He worked for a factory here in Portland, building components for cars. He would work very odd hours, go to work at 2 o'clock in the morning and work till whenever, and it was just hard. They had different lives and different schedules going. They were fighting more, and she seemed to get tied up with some rough people. He really loved her, but I think things were just out of hand. He didn't know how to fix it. So she had kind of moved out, and he had no idea where she had been going and staying.
Carrie tells the detectives that he still believed he and Margarita might get back together.
The day that Carrie last saw her, she had stayed with him at their place in Westbrook over the course of a night or a couple of previous nights.
But Carrie reveals that when he arrived home from work on November 10th, Margarita wasn't alone.
Carrie comes home, and this is when he finds her with Anthony Pratt.
Carrie explains that during their separation, Margarita had started dating Anthony Pratt, a young man from New York.
It seems as though Carrie Scott knew what was going on at the very least. He seemed to understand that Margarita Scott had a relationship with Anthony Pratt. He, I guess, was willing to get over it in the short term because he maybe felt like she would come back to him eventually.
Carrie says Margarita told him she wanted to come back home, this time for good. At 2:30 p.m., Carrie agrees to drive Margarita and Anthony back to the apartment where they've been staying.
The plan was to drop Anthony off and Margarita to get her belongings and come back with Carrie.
Now, she wouldn't let Carrie drive them directly to the house because she did not want Carrie to know where she had been staying. So they wanted to be dropped off at the Cumberland Farms, and he was not to follow them.
He waited there for 30 to 45 minutes, and Margarita never returned, and he just assumed that she had left him, that was the final straw, and she had chosen Anthony over him.
There's a basic principle in criminology and psychology that the avoidance of pain is a more powerful motivator than the pursuit of pleasure. So his tolerating this infidelity, his preparing to be humiliated and drive his wife and her paramour around is actually a better trade-off than being without her. But in spite of all that support, if you want to call it that, circumstances don't change. She still ends up dead, and he's the prime suspect.
The detectives asked Carrie how Margarita ended up with their SUV on November 10th.
Sometime during the early evening of the 10th, around 8 o'clock, she came back to the house in Westbrook, and she had a spare key because they shared the vehicle. She then took the vehicle and went back to where she had been staying, in the Cumberland Farms neighborhood.
He received a message from Margarita. Just said, Carrie, I apologize for taking the vehicle. I know you have to go to work. I'll bring the vehicle back at 2. Carrie was angry. He had to be to work. So he began to call to try to get a hold of Margarita. And she never responded.
He thought that she finally left him, and she went to New York with the boyfriend. And so Carrie turned around and went to the Westbrook police to report his vehicle missing. It was determined the vehicle was registered to both of them. So Westbrook police said, well, we can't take a stolen report on the vehicle. It's rightfully hers as much as it is yours.
To the detectives, a number of elements of Carrie's story just don't add up.
Anytime you're going to have a homicide like that, the husband is going to be someone that's going to be looked at. Carrie's whole demeanor through this whole thing made us pause. Here you're talking about this woman that you love and all this other stuff, and the things that he allowed to happen, it was just crazy to me. I think one motive would have been jealousy right off the bat. And, he would have had opportunity if she was at the house.
Jealousy is a hair trigger response justified by the fact that someone else is trying to take from them something that they value. When people are competing for our resources, which includes love, we're prepared to act like animals.
Detectives have zeroed in on their first suspect in Margarita Scott's murder. Her husband, Carrie.
He's the last one to see her. She's missing. The vehicle's missing.
In order to narrow down their timeline and determine if Carrie is their killer, detectives need to establish when the SUV first arrived in the motel parking lot.
Basically what we did is we went back and we looked at police calls for service that happened at the motel. So as officers would spin through the lot, when their cameras were on, we would see the red SUV parked there. The first time that we saw it was on November 11th at 2:38 in the morning.
The detectives can now be certain that the SUV with Margarita's body inside appeared in the parking lot just 6 hours after she borrowed the vehicle from Carrie, making her time of death between 8 p.m. and 2:38 a.m.
How did the vehicle get there? Obviously we wanted to know that.
What happened to Margarita Scott during those 6 hours?
Maybe he was totally mad about what she was doing, and he's had enough of it. He gets into a quarrel with her out of the jealousy he has. It gets violent, and he kills her.
Jealousy can drive a person to kill, to hurt, to stalk. It's basically an insecurity in that person. And then when it gets really bad, your relationship is pretty much done. But they don't want it to end. They'd rather lose that person than have anyone else have that person in their life.
When detectives question Carey about where he was at 2:30 a.m. when the SUV carrying Margarita's dead body was seen arriving at the motel, he tells them he was at work from 2 o'clock a.m. until 2 o'clock p.m. on November 11th.
When we went back and did the forensics on Carey's cell phone, as well as the interviews of his employers, his friends, his neighbors, we were able to show that everything that Carey told us about where he was, the time frames that he gave us, they all matched up.
We were able to see through phone records on Margarita's phone all the times that he was calling, looking for her, leaving voicemail messages. He noticed that the credit card was being used in New York. So he had every indication that she was alive and possibly living in New York.
With Carey placed solidly at work from 2 o'clock a.m. until 2 o'clock p.m., he couldn't have killed Margarita and dropped the body at 2:38 a.m. The detectives then turned their focus to the new boyfriend, Anthony Pratt, who Carey says Margarita was with on the day she disappeared.
Part of our investigation obviously identified where Anthony Pratt and Margarita had been spending time. This was an apartment that was actually a home that was rented by Chris and Tennille Jennings.
Tennille and Christopher Jennings are a married couple with 2 young children, and Chris is a local drug dealer who is well known to Portland police.
Chris was also known by the street name of Red. Our investigation revealed that Chris had a history of drug trafficking. He's originally from New York. He traveled here to Maine with his wife and 2 children. They rented this home, and part of his job, the only job that Chris had, was distributing crack cocaine with Anthony Pratt.
Looking for answers, detectives set out to locate Anthony Pratt and Christopher Jennings.
With the phone records, we were able to locate an address that Christopher was living at Concord Street in Portland.
We went to the apartment to check on these people, and we looked in the house, and it looked like nobody living on the first floor where they supposedly were supposed to be. And I contacted the landlord, and she told us she bought the building, and she told the Jennings that they had to move, that she was going to do renovations and redo the apartment.
The evidence technicians went there and they started searching around, and they went into the basement and found a huge red-brown stain that was consistent with blood in the basement, and they were able to track it and follow it along the piping. Then they went upstairs and they found more blood in the baseboard and along the bottom of the door that went into the apartment.
A blood sample is sent to the lab for DNA testing, and the results come back with a positive match for Margarita Scott.
It now became a crime scene, as far as we were concerned. So, but the problem was, everything had been torn out, so we didn't know what had happened.
The destruction of the Jennings' former apartment presents a serious setback for the investigation.
Tampering in a crime scene is ultimately fatal to the credibility of any evidence recovered from those scenes. In this case, we see not so much tampering as the destruction of the scene, to the point that anything found there later on is going to be so substantially, dramatically different, you lack then the probable cause to make an arrest. And certainly, even if you make an arrest, you've got major issues in terms of meeting that reasonable doubt benchmark in court.
With evidence that Margarita was killed at the Jennings' old apartment, the detectives pursue an injunction to halt the renovation. Now their number 1 priority is to track down Chris and his wife Tennille and Anthony Pratt.
We found them through the landlord. She gave us an address, which she thought they had moved to for any mail or whatever, so we went and confronted them about Margarita, and they were quite shocked, and they actually thought that Margarita had gone to New York and she was with Anthony.
The The detectives want to know when the Jennings last saw Anthony Pratt.
Chris tells us that on the morning of the 11th, Anthony had to return back to New York right away. He told Chris and Tennille that his grandfather was in dire need of him, and so he had to return because of Hurricane Sandy.
The detectives questioned the Jennings about their whereabouts on November 10th, the night Margarita Scott disappeared.
Both Chris and Tennille remembered the date specifically. And for us as investigators, who remembers 2 months ago? They both gave similar stories about what they did and where their whereabouts were on November 10th.
As the Jennings continue to talk to the detectives, a police search of their new home raises another red flag.
When they were checking the house, they went into the rooms, and they went into the bedroom, they went into the closet, and they noticed a door in the ceiling for the crawl space up above where they were. So they popped up the door to look in the thing, and when they did, they heard a thud hit. And then they pushed the door up, and they looked, and there was a handgun.
It was a High Point Smith & Wesson .40 caliber handgun, possibly the murder weapon.
With the discovery of a .40 caliber handgun, the same caliber used to kill Margarita Scott, suspicion shifts to drug dealer Chris Jennings and his wife Tennille.
Chris might have been mad because maybe Margarita owes him money for drugs.
Detectives haul Chris and Tennille Jennings down to the station for questioning.
Chris and Tennille both stated that it was Chris's birthday, and so they had gone out that night into the Old Port. They were dropped off by Margarita sometime around 11 o'clock at night. They went to some clubs and bars.
Anthony and Margarita were supposed to be babysitting the kids on the night of the party. Margarita was set to come pick them up at 1 o'clock in the morning when the bars closed. Well, around 1 o'clock in the morning, the bars were closed and they emptied out, and Chris and his wife decided, since it's his birthday, they wanted to know if there was some place they could go until later hours.
They did not have their cell phone with them, so Tennille was able to ask somebody to borrow a phone. She called Margarita and spoke to Margarita and said, "Don't bother to come get us. We're going to take a cab over to one of the strip clubs and hang out, and we'll get a ride there. Where are you?" And she said, "I'm home with Anthony." Tennille tells us that she makes another phone call at around 2 a.m. from the club, and when she calls the house, she speaks to Anthony and asks, where's Margarita?
And he says, "I don't know." He says she left and she went to bring the truck back, and she's never come back.
It's around 3:30 in the morning. Tennille and Christopher took a cab from the strip club to their home, and when they arrived, they found Anthony laying on the couch with one of the children on his chest sleeping.
If Margarita's body was dropped at 2:38 a.m., about 40 minutes after the Jennings' second phone call home, the timeline shows both of them had the opportunity to kill her just after 2 a.m. and before they returned home at 3:30 a.m.
So Chris and Tennille went to bed. Then the next morning, Anthony Pratt woke up. He said he's got to get back to New York.
Once Anthony left to go back to New York, they might have had phone conversations, but they never saw him again. And they never saw Margarita either.
Detectives want to know about the .40 caliber gun found in the Jennings home, the same caliber of weapon used to kill Margarita.
Initially, Chris and Tennille lied about having a gun or knowing anything about a gun, and they were questioned hard about that. And then finally, Chris Jennings admitted that he and Anthony had purchased it. Tennille didn't want the gun around the children, so they hid it up in the attic space in the closet.
But under intense questioning, Chris reveals a significant detail. On the night Margarita disappeared, there had been a conflict between her and Tennille.
Tennille was very jealous of the whole relationship between Christopher and Margarita. Tennille had been cheated on by Christopher in the past, so she was pretty antsy about the whole thing.
It's very dangerous to overlook a female as a suspect just because you assume more times than not it's a male. If you don't look at that female, that's the person that's going to get away with murder.
On the evening of the 10th, before Chris and Tennille went out, I don't know if she noticed her husband and Margarita were being over-friendly with each other, but she did make a comment to her, "If I ever find out you're messing around with my husband or anything, I'll kill you." Tennille, she could have discovered that, in fact, something did happen, and she was going to make good on what she said. There was a gun there. It was in her apartment. She had plenty of opportunity, and so that was a possibility, and a possibility we had to look at.
Is that a motive to kill? It has been in the past.
The love triangle motive, that's common because you have someone who is full of so much emotion towards two people. They may be upset at their lover, they may feel betrayed. And then towards the other person, they may feel an incredible amount of anger and the desire for revenge.
During the Jennings questioning, new DNA results come back from the lab, and the evidence is explosive.
Through a sex crimes kit, we found DNA, but we didn't know that at the time of the autopsy. A sex crimes kit will give us, hopefully, DNA of the last person to be intimate with Margarita.
It was shown that Margarita had recent sex with Christopher. The timeline would be significant for that because the way Margarita was found, it had to have been a recent sexual encounter, probably on November 10th. So we have to look at Chris again.
We confronted Chris Jennings with this, and he finally said yes, he did have sex, and it was the days before his birthday. There was something going on at the house, a little disagreement, so he took Margarita and asked him to give him a ride to the store. And then they went up by Hall School, which is nearby, and in the parking lot, and he had sex with Margarita.
Could Tennille have found out about Chris and Margarita's sexual encounter? And if so, did she follow through on her threat to kill Margarita?
Jealousy. That would be the motive right there. A motive for Tennille to kill Margarita.
As the focus of the investigation shifts to Tennille Jennings, detectives want to find out what she knew about the relationship between Chris and Margarita.
Chris and Tennille all along would tell lies, and then we would question them about those lies, and we would have facts to back it up, and they would then tell us the truth after realizing that we knew what we were talking about.
Lying, obviously, is one of the fastest ways to derail an investigation. People may be lying because they have some involvement or they're looking to cover up either the role of themselves or somebody else in the crime. And this may have an actual catastrophic effect on the eventual investigation.
So Tennille starts to explain that she didn't know that Christopher and Margarita had been intimate. Tennille was screaming and crying. She was telling us that it wasn't true, that we were lying. Just did not take it well at all. And it was a genuine reaction. She was upset. If she knew anything about it, that would be the time that she would say something, if she was pissed off enough.
To confirm if Tennille is telling the truth, detectives dig deeper into her alibi.
We were able to track down the woman whose phone they borrowed in the old port, and she was able to confirm that on that particular night she remembers someone asking to use her phone, and that they were asking if there were any places that were open later, and Chris and Tennille were directed to the strip club, PT's, because it stayed open until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And then when they got to the strip club, They had a private dance, and they were trying to make a hookup with the dancer, so the dancer put Chris's phone number in her phone and called it 2 times, and those records were on Chris's phone at home.
So that placed them solidly at PT's until that time I wanted.
With the Jennings alibis checking out, that means they couldn't have killed Margarita between 1 a.m. when they last spoke to her and 2:38 a.m. when the body was dropped. Chris then points the finger directly at Anthony Pratt, Margarita's boyfriend.
So he called Anthony on his cell phone, and he talked to Anthony. And he told Anthony, the police are here, they found Margarita, she's dead, and he confronted Anthony with all of this. And Anthony's reply is, well, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Chris says, well, you killed her. What do you want me to do? That was his reply.
Anthony doesn't confess to Chris, but he doesn't deny having killed Margarita either. To the detectives, the phone call puts Anthony in a whole new light.
So, even with the fact that Chris had sex with Margarita earlier and that Tennille had made a threat that she would kill Margarita, at the end of the day, when we looked at everything, the forensics, the interviews, the timeline only shows there's only one person that had the opportunity to commit this murder and to do it in the location that it happened was Anthony Pratt.
I see Anthony Pratt as a young man who's an under-controlled batterer, someone who engages in violence to exert his superiority and regain control of the relationship. Sometimes people like this almost see women as property, right? As something to be owned or ownership. And so if you're not achieving those expectations or you're behaving differently, this angers these type of people. There's no good ways that they know to respond other than to resort to violence.
With Anthony, now the prime suspect in Margarita's murder, and at large in New York City, detectives step up their search by enlisting the help of the NYPD to track him down.
Finding someone in a city like New York who's gone AWOL in an investigation is like a needle in a haystack.
We were already 2 months behind the 8 ball when this whole case started. We needed to find Anthony Pratt before there was greater opportunity for him to flee.
I don't think there's any doubt in his mind that the police were down looking for him.
But then they catch a break, and Anthony returns Detective Vogel's numerous calls.
I kept it very light. I just said that, I wanted to talk to him. I had heard that he was engaged to Margarita, and he had told me that he hadn't seen her, but he was willing to help out any way he could. And my thing was not to be antagonistic or aggressive in any way. I just wanted him to tell me his story. And so he had agreed to come to Portland.
Face to face with Pratt for the very first time, the detectives hope to finally get at the truth of who killed Margarita Scott.
You know something about this.
No, I do not know anything.
Absolutely you do.
They said they seen her in December, or I don't know.
Nobody has seen her. Her family, her husband, nobody has seen her. When we started to ask him about certain things, and he would lie about them.
Rita takes Chris and Tennille into town, right?
Right.
Okay, so you're home watching the kids. Rita comes back there, does she?
Not that I know of.
Not that you know.
I don't know if
Okay, well then Tennille calls the house at 1 o'clock in the morning. Rita answers the phone. They tell her don't come pick her up. So that must put Rita back at the apartment, right?
I don't know.
You don't know.
He confirmed that Chris and Tennille had gone out that night, that it was Chris's birthday, and that Margarita had dropped them off, and that she never came back.
Anthony says that he left first thing the next morning to go to New York City, just like Chris Jennings had said.
It was so bizarre in the entire time from her disappearance to when she was found. Anthony Pratt never called, never tried to call her. And the phone records show that she wasn't using her phone to call him, because most of the calls on her records on her phone were from her husband trying to find her until the phone died.
The evidence against Anthony Pratt is compelling, but entirely circumstantial.
Circumstantial cases are harder to prosecute because it relies on a lot of inferences from the evidence that is available. And so where prosecutors will say it should lead you to there, if the defense attorney can say actually could lead you to A, B, C, then that means it's reasonable doubt. But if the prosecutor has physical evidence, DNA evidence, anything that's hard evidence to connect the dots, then the prosecutor is going to be more likely to get to that reasonable doubt threshold.
In an effort to build a stronger case against Anthony, detectives returned to the neighborhood of the Jennings' former apartment, where Margarita was last seen, to search for anyone who may have seen or heard anything unusual the night of the murder.
The canvas establishes the players who are in the neighborhood or in the area at the time of the crime. It captures the world in which this crime occurred, and these are very important people to come back to later, because while they may not have seen anything suspicious, investigators sometimes need to be asking them about something not suspicious or something seemingly harmless that they saw. That may actually be as important as what they deem to be suspicious.
Just doing a canvass of the neighbors. Nobody heard a gunshot, but there was a neighbor. She had gotten home from work in the early morning hours. She was watching a movie, and she went out on her front porch to have a cigarette, and it was 2 a.m. She saw a black male with a hoodie carrying what she thought in her mind looked like a body, and then she convinced herself that she was seeing things. It was wrapped in trash bags, and the guy was having a difficult time carrying it, and went to a red SUV and opened up the back and discarded the item in the back of the SUV. There's no question Anthony Pratt is the one that murdered Margarita.
Detectives have an eyewitness account of a body being dragged from the Jennings' former apartment that fits perfectly within their timeline. We now know that Margarita Scott was killed between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock a.m. on November 11th.
Well, the timeline is very important, and I do it with all my major cases. It tells a definite story. There's no question. I mean, this is what happened.
Detectives place Anthony on the timeline and theorize that he killed Margarita in the Jennings' former apartment. But they need physical evidence, and the apartment has been ripped apart.
The evidence technicians had this grueling process of actually putting a jigsaw puzzle back together. The wooden paneling on the floor had to be picked up and placed on the walls to put it back together. As they did that, they lifted each piece, inspected it, and in one of the pieces of paneling, they located on the back side of the paneling what initially looked like maybe a piece of putty from somebody maybe spackling or something. And what it actually turned out to be was a piece of paper and a piece of chewing gum. Green chewing gum had been pushed through a hole and sealed with the gum. As they put the paneling back on the wall, they got to a spot where within the plaster they were able to cut that piece out, and behind that they were able to locate an actual bullet.
So if you didn't look at your walls closely and didn't see it, you would have never noticed this little piece of paper covering a hole stuck there with gum.
Evidence was sent to the state crime lab for ballistics on the bullet, as well as DNA for the chewing gum. The bullet that was recovered could only have been fired from a high-point Smith & Wesson .40 caliber handgun.
Connecting the bullet to the same kind of weapon that was used to kill Margarita Scott is a significant step forward. But detectives still need physical evidence to directly link Anthony Pratt to the weapon.
The cheek swab that was sent out for Anthony's DNA came back positive that it was his DNA on the chewing gum that was placed in the hole. We know by that he had to have been at that scene. There's just no two ways around it.
The detectives are now able to piece together Margarita Scott's final 24 hours.
Margarita would have stayed with Carrie on November 9th. November 10th, Carrie took Anthony and Margarita to Chris and Tennille's house. The plan was to drop Anthony off and Margarita get her belongings and come back with Carrie. She never did. It was Chris Jennings' birthday. Margarita did take them out around 11 o'clock at night. Sometime after 1 a.m. on the 11th, she got a call from Tennille using a stranger's phone saying, "Don't bother picking us up, we're going to stay out."
I believe his anger toward the fact that she still was returning home, that was the last straw. I think that she was ready to leave and was going to return that truck to her husband and probably stay at her own home like she's been doing regularly, and Anthony was going to have no part of that. It was either she stayed or she wasn't going at all. Based on all the evidence that we were able to obtain, Anthony shot Margarita in the living room floor of that home. He picked her up, took her outside, dumped her in the back of that red truck, drove the red truck. It's less than 2 miles from the home to the motel's parking lot.
On April 2nd, 2013, Anthony Pratt is arrested for the murder of Margarita Scott. He's found guilty and sentenced to 42 years in prison.
I think it was almost more for the family that you don't want to let them down. It's the most serious offense when someone's life is taken, and there is a lot of pressure from friends and family to find out who did it.
I still wake up every morning and I still think police work is an honorable job. There are always going to be a faction of society that does not play by the rules, and somebody has to keep those people in check. It was a case from the very beginning, the pieces fell together. It was just hard work of old-fashioned police work, and some just found it to be justice with them. This was definitely a frenzy. Essentially, the person was deserved.
Ambitiously.
People were terrified. People need a reason that bad things happen.
A dark mystery with multiple suspects.
There were sisters, but there was no sister.
I'm just thinking, what do I do if he freaks out?
There was a lot of dangerous optimistic that within that family said.
The truth will be revealed.
What stood out to me as this crime scene is there was no rhyme or reason. It just didn't make sense. If Keith did this, he needs to pay for it.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. On the banks of the St. Joseph River sits Niles, Michigan, a community brimming with civic pride.
So Niles it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody. It's the kind of community where you could meet a stranger and you both know the same person. And fortunately, we don't have a lot of violent crime here.
If crime happens, people are more than willing to help you. People respect police. Yes sir, no sir. Here, people get involved.
But on one cold February afternoon, something so shocking happens, no one knows what to do.
Yes, Karen. This is a 911 transfer. The gentleman is saying there's been a shooting.
Okay, where's the suspect at? There's no suspect. Their door was open. We've been trying to find them all morning. They were supposed to be at work, and I walked in the house, and they've been shot.
We received a 911 call from a father who says that his son and his daughter-in-law are deceased. He thinks it's a homicide.
Okay, sir?
Yes.
Have you been inside the house?
I have.
Okay. Are they injured or are they deceased?
They're deceased. Oh, my God.
I immediately called one of the troopers on a cell phone, and she said, "You need to get over here."
The victims are Carolyn and John Tarwacki, two beloved musicians who live with their nephew, Keelan.
John and Carolyn met late in life. They met online. They were just in a great place in their life because they had found each other. They were happily married.
Carolyn was a good soul, as I put it. She used to pick up old music instruments, and she would repair them and try to help kids who couldn't afford an instrument. And John was a Navy veteran. Hard workers, both of them.
Tasked with investigating their deaths are Detectives Fabian Suarez of the Michigan State Police and local detective Kristen Daly, who has lived in this community for 20 years.
When we arrived there, that's when the light bulb went off for me that, oh, these are people that I know. My sister-in-law was very good friends with Carolyn in high school. So there was an immediate connection there, and I felt a lot more responsibility.
Detectives begin analyzing the crime scene, trying to imagine what might have taken place.
We walk into the foyer area of the house. Obviously, we take a quick moment, we stand, we scan. I can see John Tarwacki. He's got stab wounds on his back. We walk over to the right, there's a living room. We look in there and we see Carolyn. We look to the left, there's a bathroom there. One of the first things I notice is there's a towel on the floor with hair clippings, and there's a razor on the sink. So to me, it tells me he was shaving his head. My gut feeling is the killer was confronted by John. He takes the first shot. He hits John right in the jaw. He shoots again. John throws up his arm, and then he turns, and like he's trying to escape, and he collapses right there. So now John is out of the picture. Now the killer can focus his attention on Carolyn.
At the time that you first looked at her, it was almost hard to tell exactly what had happened to her. She had been badly beaten. Being beaten is usually very immediate. It usually dictates that that's somebody that you know really well and you're really, really angry at when you see that level of injury and that level of violence visited upon somebody. And later it was determined that she was both stabbed and shot. And that's an extreme level of violence against the nicest person that you literally would ever meet. Made absolutely no sense.
To find out who ruthlessly killed this loving couple, police must reconstruct the final 24 hours of the Tarwacki's lives.
The timeline's important in every homicide case. You have to know where all your players are in any given moment to create an alibi or to break an alibi, to set your timeline so you can discover when was their vulnerability, when did the murder occur.
Investigators start building John and Carolyn's timeline by interviewing the person who found them, John's father.
When I first met John Tarwacki, the senior, obviously he was very distraught. How else could you be? You just walked in, you find your son and your daughter-in-law murdered. He said John and Carolyn had an 8 a.m. meeting at the high school. They never showed up. This is not like Carolyn. She will not miss work. She will not miss appointments, anything like that. So the school called Quinlan and Babbage, which is where they worked, and said Carolyn never showed up. What happened?
John's sister worked for the company too, so they called John's father, like, can you go check and see what's going on?
He, in turn, said he tried calling the house, he tried calling the cell phones, and nothing happened, so he decided to get in the car and go knock on the door.
Hoping to flush out the Tarwacki's timeline further, detectives reach out to Carolyn's mother, Sharon.
Sharon tells me that she talked with Carolyn on the phone that morning. She was having some issues with her computer, so she was just venting some frustration to her mom. Just a normal touching base with your mom in the morning. Sharon said there was nothing about that phone call that made her suspicious.
Detectives pull Sharon's cell phone records and verify that the call started at 6:10 a.m. and lasted exactly 12 minutes.
The last time she talks to her mother is at 6:22. Says goodbye, not realizing either one that it's the last time.
But what happened after she hung up with her mother is still a mystery. Knowing that Carolyn was on her computer that morning gives them something to work with. Investigators dig into her laptop logs.
Carolyn logged onto the computer at 6:43 a.m. and then 7:03, the computer goes dormant, meaning that there's no longer any interaction with the keyboard.
Every time you hit a key on any device, there is a record of that. And when we see habitual use and ongoing keystrokes and then a sudden stoppage, that stoppage point serves as a great start for what happened next. Were they interrupted? Were they pulled away from the computer, or were they actually murdered at that particular time?
Based on when the computer goes dormant, Carolyn and John could have been killed any time between 7:03 a.m. and just before their bodies were found at 12:45 p.m. The bodies are sent off for autopsy, and the forensics team starts scouring the house for potential murder weapons.
We're looking for a knife, and we're looking for a gun at that point.
We don't know if he used one of the kitchen knives. So we took all the knives that looked like they could have been used for the murders, and we sent those to the medical examiner.
As they continue to work their way through the crime scene, investigators struggle to come up with a rational theory for the murders.
What stood out to me as this crime scene is there was no rhyme or reason. There was no sign of any forced entry whatsoever. There were valuables laying around. You could think it was a breaking and entering. Someone had gone in to steal things, but there was computers, there were laptops, iPads, cash money laying around. There was even prescription drugs in the medicine cabinets.
It's not until they make their way to the back of the house that the first clue into the identity of the killer reveals itself.
From where we're standing, I can hear a dog going crazy, and it turns out this is Wrigley, a 200-pound mastiff.
The Tarwackis had a large dog. It was ginormous, and it was on the back porch area. And so in their kitchen, you turned and you could either go down the basement or you can go out into a back porch.
Once we get to the back door, that's when we see footprints. One set of footprints coming in, one set of footprints coming out.
The footprints showed that somebody had entered and exited through the back door, which was unusual because they would have had to get past that dog. And that dog was incredibly protective of Carolyn. So normally, if you are a stranger and you open someone's back porch door and you are greeted by a large mastiff, you turn around and walk away. You don't continue to enter the home. And if it's a stranger, why is the level of violence on Carolyn so great? That told us that it was somebody that they knew.
Now, they're hoping this path will lead them to the killer's doorstep.
You have to work fast, you gotta work furiously, because if he did it once and he did it twice, he can definitely do it again.
Investigators believe that the rage-fueled homicide of Carolyn and John Tarwacki was an intentional act, committed by someone who knew them.
A crime like this could be really devastating for a small community. The word would get out, and it would likely take over the town within a few hours. There would be a sense of, we're all in danger, who's next?
The only piece of hard evidence investigators have from the crime scene is a trail of footprints at the back of the house.
Well, we're pretty sure there's one killer. There's only one set of footprints.
The stride on the way in was short, like a normal walking stride, and the stride on the way out was wider, like a running stride. It tells us that, when he approached the house, he was calm, and when he left the house, he was agitated and fleeing because he had just committed the murders.
Once we get photographs, they are able to get us a good shoe size and a very good tread pattern.
We could actually look at the picture and see 12 and the shoe impression, so we knew it was a size 12 shoe. We were able to confirm that it was a Route 66 shoe that was put out by Kmart, but discontinued in 2008.
So this tells me this person is wearing old shoes that were cheap, basically. It's not a person that has a lot of money, that's spending a lot of money.
Using the footprints, detectives follow the killer's path.
There's an easement. Nobody really knows, unless you're from that area, you're not going to know that easement there. It's kind of like a power line easement. So those footprints, we were able to follow them away from the house towards what's Yankee Street. So we do a neighborhood canvas. It's just as it's called. We go to every door within a mile, north, west, south, east, every direction. We knock on the doors.
One of the apartment's investigators' canvas belongs to Sherry Lintz. When they knock on her door, they find her son Keith there as well.
Keith is known to us. He's had many, many problems with law enforcement. We know the Lintz family. They're just a lot of family members have been, unfortunately, been on the wrong side of the law.
Detective Suarez consults local detective daily on whether or not she thinks Keith could be a person of interest.
I'd heard the name. I knew that he was in trouble and had been in trouble and had a criminal history, but I wasn't familiar with him being connected to the Tarwackis at all.
Investigators question Keith about whether he knew the Tarwackis and his whereabouts that morning when they were killed.
Keith Lintz says he may have walked past the residence and may have waved at John Tarwacki, but he says no, he doesn't know him. Then Sherry Lintz, she's able to confirm to us that Keith was at the home at 8 a.m. She said she woke up to go to work and Keith was asleep on the couch. She also is able to alibi him, saying that she actually took Keith to work on the morning of the homicides.
Satisfied with the Lintz's accounting of their whereabouts, police move on. And it pays off almost right away.
Later on that morning, we found a neighbor who said, yep, I was outside smoking a cigarette, started my car up. And that's when I see a young man running down the alleyway. She is positive that was, I believe, at 7:45 a.m. Those footprints were right by her house, maybe 30 feet from her deck. She told us, she goes, you never see anybody going through there at this time of the morning. Nobody ever sees there, and that's what caught her attention.
This new information is critical. Assuming the running man is the killer, investigators are now able to pinpoint when the Tarwackis were murdered.
So as best we could figure, it happened sometime from the time when Carolyn's computer goes dormant to 7:45. So it's almost like a 40-minute window that this murder could have occurred in.
It's an unusual time of day for a double homicide to take place.
It was very brazen. Nobody commits a homicide when everybody is getting ready to go to work. You're taking the chance of being seen. There's too many eyes out. Too many people are awake. Most homicides are going to involve at the time of darkness when not many people are around or you cannot be seen.
The eyewitness didn't get a good look at the man's face, but she says he was tall.
She said that she saw a white male, right around 6 feet tall, hard to pin down his age, between 20 and 30 years old, she thought, wearing a dark, whether it was a jacket or a hoodie, but he had a hood up, and he was running past her house out towards the main road.
The description immediately rings a bell for Detective Daly. It sounds like it could be Keelan, Carolyn and John's teenage nephew, who has been living with them.
I was familiar with Keelan because his younger brother had been on the same T-ball team with my son. So at that point, Fabian's like, oh, well, you can be the one to go talk to him at the school then.
Keelan is the son of Carolyn's sister, Katie, and her husband, David.
Keelan is kind of a combative individual. One of the reasons he was living with John and Carolyn was because he didn't get along with David, and they had fought quite a bit. The fights consisted of a lot of yelling and screaming. So I'm just thinking, what do I do if he freaks out? What do I do if he's actually the suspect and he knows, immediately why I'm there?
We know that Keelan lives at the house. He automatically becomes our first suspect because he was probably the last people that saw John and Carolyn alive. So I had asked Kristen Daly to conduct the interview because I wanted that female perspective to talk to him, probably get more information. We have to determine as quickly as possible, is he involved? Did he commit the crime? Does he know who committed the crime?
When I got to the school and they brought him out of his classroom, he looked confused. He knew who I was, but he couldn't really figure out why I was there. Keelan's sitting there, and he's looking at us. I could just see the conflicting play of emotion on his face. And then Fabian tells him exactly why we were there. He said, John and Carolyn are dead, and we need to talk to you. And Keelan completely melted down. He just completely had a breakdown right there. I said, I need you to go through your morning. I need you to tell me exactly what you did. I need to tell me exactly, as best you can remember, what time things happened. He told me that his Aunt Carolyn woke him up in the morning, shortly after 6. He leaves the house about 6:30 in the morning, and his grandmother lives 2 doors down from John and Carolyn. So at 6:35, he goes to his grandmother's, talks to her really quick. He grabs some pop and some beef jerky. He's there for maybe not even 10 minutes, if that long, because I think he catches the bus then at 6:45.
Detective Daly checks Keelan's alibi with his grandmother, Sharon.
Sharon says she gets off the phone with Carolyn at 6:22. Keelan shows up within 5-10 minutes of that phone conversation to Sharon's home. Keelan is calm, he is clean, so he wouldn't have had time to commit those murders, and he would have been a mess physically.
We follow up with the school with the times the bus is there, cameras in the school. We know he walked into the school. We talked to the teachers. We know he walked into the classroom.
He had a backpack, and there was a empty pop bottle in the outside of his backpack, and also a bag of jerky. So that corroborated his story. Also, there was not a good motive for Keelan. He was in a really good place. John and Carolyn lost their lives, but Keelan lost his future.
With Keelan's whereabouts verified from 6:22 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., detectives conclude he couldn't have killed the Tarwackis. According to Keelan, he hated living with his mother and stepfather and wanted to stay with Carolyn and John permanently.
Once Keelan moved out of the home, his grades picked up, and he really liked it. Obviously, there was no domestic problems. There was no fighting, anything like that in the house. He really liked living there.
Detectives then discover that the Tarwackis had filed for legal guardianship, so Keelan wouldn't have to return to his parents' home. In fact, the attorney had served the papers to Keelan's mother, Katie, just 2 days before the murders took place.
I knew Katie, so I was already familiar with her temperament. She doesn't care what you think about her, and she will tell you exactly what's on her mind. can come across as very aggressive, very combative. And Katie did not want Carolyn to have guardianship, and she was angry. And knowing Katie's personality and knowing that she could be pretty aggressive, and just seeing the level of violence visited on Carolyn, your mind goes to that first person who's angry. And that circled back to Katie.
The investigation into the brutal double homicide of Carolyn and John Tarwacki is zeroing in on Carolyn's sister, Katie.
When we interview Katie, basically what she tells us, growing up, Carolyn was treated better than she was. They were sisters, but there was no sisterly love. Katie despised Carolyn. She tells us, hey, I didn't kill my sister, but I'm not going to miss her. She told me, I've always believed that Carolyn was trying to take my son because she didn't have kids of her own. And she really believed this, so obviously this raises a flag.
It almost seemed like she didn't care. A normal person, you tell them that their brother or sister has died. It doesn't matter if they fought 20 minutes ago, they're devastated. This is their sibling, this is somebody they love. And she didn't act like your normal sibling to a victim of a horrendous crime. She's a little detached.
When people don't react as expected in a police interview, it immediately throws up a red flag. Why are they acting this way? Are they potentially involved in this crime? Do they dislike, a person enough to commit an act of violence? And in this case, you're wondering, could this sister have engaged in something violent towards this couple?
But some things just don't add up with this theory. The eyewitness said she saw a man between 20 and 30 years old fleeing the scene, not a 43-year-old woman. And she said this happened at 7:45 a.m.
Katie actually lived pretty much next door to me. She is a bus driver for this same school district, and she drove the bus past my house every morning. So we were able to confirm with the bus garage that yes, Katie showed up to work, she came on time, and she was driving her bus. And there just wasn't time during a bus route for her to stop at the house and commit this murder.
Detectives consider a different theory.
I know that she didn't commit the homicide, but maybe the husband decided to do it. Through police reports, we know that David drank. We believe he had a drinking problem. And we know that there's a lot of, domestic violence in that home. There was a lot of hate. There was a lot of discontent within that family circle. So if you want to keep your wife happy, if you want to keep your family happy, you're going to want to do something to help her.
David was quiet to Katie's, more bombastic, volatile personality, but nobody had any doubt that if she'd asked him to do this, that he would have done that for her.
With David now in their crosshairs, detectives put the timeline to the test to determine where he was when the Tarwackis were killed.
I believe from the timeline that we built up, we know that the morning of the homicides, David had to take the kids to the babysitters. He says he was there at 7:30 a.m. dropping the kids off. We go to the babysitter, and we were able to substantiate his whereabouts. He works in South Bend, so it takes him almost 20 minutes to get to work. He started work at 8 a.m. We follow up on his work. We know that at that work, they actually have palm scanners to get into the building. We know that he put his palm there, that he scanned his palm, and we know that he was at work. So there was no way that he would have been the killer, that he was involved.
Having eliminated all three of the people closest to the Tarwackis from the suspect pool, detectives are stumped.
There were so many things about this case that didn't flow from a normal investigative standpoint. We were still really focused at that point on this is somebody that they knew, somebody that was angry with them. And we had talked to everybody that we knew that knew John and Carolyn. We talked to John's, ex-wives. We dug deep into his past trying to find a motive. And just nothing was panning out. Everything was coming up a dead end.
Investigators are forced to consider whether the murders may have been more random than they first appeared.
People were terrified. People need a reason that bad things happen. When there's no reason that something bad has happened, then everybody thinks, then that could be me. And that freaks people out, obviously. We all like to believe that if we just do the right thing at the right time, then we're all safe, but that's not clearly how the world works. That was the first time I ever had trouble sleeping after a case. It was awful. It was awful because it was unsolved and just no idea at that point. And the other thing that haunts you is, did you miss something?
As it turns out, they did.
I received a call from the mother, Sharon McKnight, who is cleaning out the house to sell. She is cleaning out the refrigerator, thawing out the freezer, and as she's removing items, she says she found a bloody knife. I was actually here at work. I immediately respond to the location along with one of my troopers. Sure enough, there's a bloody knife in the freezer.
Investigators have just discovered that they missed a key piece of evidence while processing the murder scene of Carolyn and John Tarwacki, a bloody knife.
The sickness feeling that goes over you is like, wow, how did we miss that? We missed it. I'm the lead investigator. I have to take responsibility for everything that goes wrong. So, yeah, it's my responsibility to make sure everything was done. It wasn't done properly. The knife is processed. DNA shows that it is Carolyn and it is John's blood on the knife. But unfortunately, there is no third party. We were hoping maybe to find DNA from our suspect that could be identified, but there was not.
Having hit yet another roadblock, the case goes cold. Then 2.5 years later, Detective Suarez receives a call that breathes new life into the investigation.
Patricia Wiles was a local young lady. She had a run-in with the local police officer. She was stopped. She was arrested, I believe, for driving with her license suspended. When they brought her in and they booked her, she told them, I'd like to talk to the detective who's in charge of the Tarwacki homicide because I think I have information as to who killed him. This officer obviously calls me right away home. I believe it was 3 in the morning or something like that. So I obviously come to work right away. I start interviewing Patricia Wiles, and she brings up the name of Keith Lentz. Keith Lentz, who we had talked to initially, but was not on the radar.
26-year-old Keith Lentz was someone they interviewed on the very first day of the investigation. His mother, Sherry, told them Keith was at home with her at the time of the murder, and back then, they had no reason to doubt her.
Patricia tells us that she was living with Keith Lentz's brother or half-brother, and on the night of the homicide, she came to the trailer, and she said Keith was just bouncing all over the place. He kept looking out the window, and she asked him, "What are you doing?" She said, "The cops are after me." And, well, why are the cops after you? She said, "Because I left my effing footprints in the yard, and they're going to find me."
Patricia tells them that Keith was heavily into crystal meth, and that night, she was afraid of him.
One of Patricia Wild's big alarming concerns was the way Keith was acting. He was acting berserk, and she said he had a gun in one hand, was waving around, but she also observed him with a couple other weapons in his belt line.
That started the ball rolling with Keith Lentz, and we really started to dig in on him as our main suspect.
To confirm Patricia's story, Detective Suarez tracks down the mother of Keith's child. She's in bad shape.
It turns out that within a month or so, I believe, of the homicides, Keith had choked her, beat her, choked her, and we were able to confirm this through South Bend Police Department records, that we obviously now know he's got the propensity for violence. now that we really got our teeth sunk into Keith Lynch, we start looking for his inner circle. We start getting more calls. The next big break really comes from another ex-girlfriend. She had a birthday party for one of her sons, and the mother told her, "Why do you have Keith Lynch here? He killed the Tarwackis. Get him out of my home. I don't want him in my house." So that started a fight. She said she asked him, "Why do people think you killed the Tarwackis?" And he told her, "Well, because they found my footprints there, but I was just taking a shortcut to my grandparents' house."
It seemed believable. If you're going to make a story up, why do you make the footprints in the snow up? Because we never had released that and people didn't know we had that as evidence.
Detectives now strongly believe Keith murdered Carolyn and John Tarwacki, but they need proof. They go back to Sherry Lintz, hoping to break his alibi. She reiterates that Keith was sleeping on the couch at 8 a.m. and that she drove him to work at 9.
So now we're working on it. We have to confirm his timeline. And at that time, he was working at Walmart in Mishawaka, Indiana. We were able to determine through work records that was not true. He never did show up for work. He didn't call in sick. He didn't call in at all, so we know that he's not there. We believe Mom's lying.
If only detectives had checked Keith's alibi back on day 1 of the investigation, they would have realized that he had both the means and the opportunity to kill the Tarwackis.
It's not uncommon to see in a lot of cases that go cold, in this case 3 years. And it doesn't matter if it's 3 months, 3 years, 30 years. I'll often tell investigators, the name of the offender is probably already in the file. He's probably already even been interviewed and falsely or wrongly screened out or excluded. And I say, always go back to what you did first and re-examine it with fresh eyes. And we see in this case, sure enough, he's spoken to in the canvas and not asked the right questions and ruled out.
Obviously, Keith is on the radar now. We tried looking for his whereabouts. We find out that Keith has fled to Nashville, Tennessee. The next day, I had to go to the doctor. My blood pressure was 200/195. We have to track him down. If Keith did this, he needs to pay for it.
Investigators believe Keith Lintz killed Carolyn and John Tarwacki. After an exhaustive search, they finally track him down in a Nashville jail, imprisoned on some minor traffic charges.
So, Keith and I have history. He doesn't like me, I don't like him. There comes a point in time where you really have to suck up your ego as investigator. As much as I want to go interview Keith, I know that if I go, he's not going to say a thing. So I sent a couple other detectives to talk to him. They do lengthy interviews with him. He denies being involved. But he also thinks that he can beat a polygraph, and he volunteers to take polygraphs. He failed both tests miserably. So we know that Keith is our main suspect, but we don't have that final nail in the coffin.
But then, they get a phone call from a man by the name of Shane Zimmerman. He says he's got information about the homicide.
Shane Zimmerman is hitting the lotto, hitting all 7 numbers in the Powerball. It's just something that you don't expect out of the blue to come, even though we are on the right trail.
Shane Zimmerman describes himself as a childhood friend of the prime suspect, Keith Lintz, who just happens to be sharing a cell with him at this very moment.
Shane says Keith told me he did it. He can't take it back, but he says he did it, and he was crying one night. He's in his bunk crying. And Shane says, what's wrong? He says, I killed him. I killed those people because they didn't deserve to die, but I can't take it back.
In order to secure a conviction, investigators need Keith's confession on tape.
Shane Zimmerman didn't want anything. He said, I've screwed up my entire life. He goes, for once in my life, I'm going to do something right.
Shane agrees to wear a wire and heads back into the cell.
But we told him, don't ask questions, you don't interrogate, you don't interview. You just act as a listening post. If he wants to talk about it, you listen.
On their end, police push Keith in a series of interviews, keeping the murders at the top of his mind.
They said, hey, Keith, we know sometimes you can go into drug-induced hysteria, and this is what happened in this case, isn't it? And, obviously he denied it there, but when he went back into the cell and was talking to Shane, he told Shane, he goes, man, they had it right on. That's what happened.
Finally, Keith breaks down and spills the whole story of the murders to Shane.
Zimmerman was a hammer that we hammered that nail home, so it was incredible stroke of luck.
With their informant's help, investigators are able to piece together John and Carolyn's final 24 hours.
We find out that Keith and his brother Brian are drinking all night long. They're doing drugs the entire night. That morning of the murders, Keith gets in a fight with the mother because he wants more money to go buy drugs. And this is very early in the morning prior to the homicides. We believe that after the mother would not give Keith money, he probably planned on doing a home invasion.
John is in getting ready for work. He is shaving. Carolyn's on her computer at 7:03. And sometime between there and 7:45, Keith Lentz is walking down the road and walks down that back alley.
He may have seen this house that looked like an easy target. Knowing the area, he walks around to the back. He then goes in the house. Keith used to have pit bulls. This guy was not scared of dogs. He lets Wrigley, the dog, into the back room and closes the door behind him. I don't think he was expecting for John and Carolyn to be home.
Especially if the dog was in the back. Maybe he thought, oh, these people are gone. Maybe there's nobody home.
I believe that she saw Keith coming in through the back door. Keith already had his gun out. He may have been doing, obviously, meth and maybe some coke or crack. I believe that she screams. John comes out of the bathroom, encounters Keith. He was just out of his mind. I don't think that he went in there with the intent to murder anyone. I think he went in there with the intent to rob. And all of a sudden, he's just been confronted by two people. And it's a fight or flight. And he decided to kill them both.
Biggest takeaway from this case was not to prejudge what you may see at a scene. This case would suggest that maybe there was emotion here that had evolved to a certain level where people got angry and perpetrated violence. And really what it says to me is sometimes, by sheer happenstance or drug use, it can culminate in explosive violence in a way that seems personal when really it's just disorganized, frantic, unexplainable behavior.
Keith Lentz is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He's convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
The timeline was incredibly important because you had this 35-40 minute window where this crime occurred, and putting together this timeline made it absolutely clear when we caught the guy who it was.
As a father, John Tarwacki said, there is no closure, and I also believe there is no closure. You may get a conviction, but it's not going to bring your kid back. It's not going to change anything. Every time Christmas comes around, every time a birthday comes around, they're not going to be there.
But what sticks with me most about this case is just how senseless it was. These were 2 normal people getting ready for work, and somebody made up their mind that they wanted something and was going to do whatever they could to get it. It's senseless. It made no sense. And it still doesn't, even after all this time. I don't know how you recover from that.